And I'm recording. Today is Friday, June 15th, 2015. My name is Dawn Dole, and I'm the Executive Director for the Taos Institute. I want to welcome everybody to this webinar today. We're so excited to be here with all of you. And our topic for the webinar today is part of our Week in Dialogue with the Author series. We offer these opportunities to be in dialogue with authors of various publications throughout the year. And these are free offerings that the Taos Institute invites anyone interested in the topic from around the world to join in. We have an online learning platform that we call the Taos Online Learning website, and we had a conversation space in that online platform during the week, Monday through Thursday. So some of you were able to join in with Tony and Joan, the authors of our book today, and the book is Healing Conversations Now. Let me get the subtitle here.
Enhanced relationships with elders and dying loved ones.
Yes, and so Tony Silbert and Joan Chardbourne are the authors, and we're so excited for them to be part of this week. If you are able to participate in the week online with them, you will see that some interesting conversation already started happening, and Tony and Joan will continue that conversation. Let me just say a little bit about the Taos Institute for those of you who don't know. We're a nonprofit educational organization, and our focus is on how we work with social construction and collaborative, appreciative, relational practices to create positive change in the world. How do we look at our relational practices to create positive change? And so we bring practitioners and scholars together to work on practices and research and to learn from each other, and it's really an exciting place to be. Very global. We've got people that participate from all over the world, and we are glad you're here today to be part of this program. Tony is an appreciative inquiry consultant. I don't know if you'd call yourself that, Tony, but I would consider you an appreciative inquiry consultant. It's an organization development background and works locally and abroad, and is just really an amazing person to work with and to be friends with and colleagues with. And Joan is his co-author. She has a doctorate in counseling psychology. She's been a professor, a consultant. She does some coaching in the US and all over the world. And she loves to combine the best of her previous professional work with deeply moving personal experiences. And so they're going to do a lot of sharing today, and they're going to ask you to do a lot of sharing. And I am going to put myself on mute and hand it over to Tony and Joan. And thank you again for joining today.
Good morning.
Good morning.
It's nice to see you all. It's nice to see put faces with names that participated online. Mark and Susan. I see that Susan joined. So we've got quite an international group joining us so far, with more to join in a moment. And Joan, I didn't know if you wanted to introduce yourself, or if we should start by finding out what attracted people to joining this call this morning first.
Oh, I think we should start with other people with getting involved and talking.
Yeah. So you feel free to unmute yourself. Again, it's the button in the left-hand corner. Would just like to hear quickly where you're from and what drew you to this topic or conversation, whether online or in person today. I'm going to start with you, Mark, because you're the next person on my list here.
Sure. I guess the discussions which the book refers to, we don't have very many of them in a lifetime, and they're obviously with people which are very important to us. And I guess there's a lot to be gained by learning from other people's experience and knowledge, rather than going and reinventing the wheel and making probably mistakes in those conversations. So I guess that's the main reason I'm here, is that inevitably will have those conversations, and I'd like them to, be as useful for everyone involved as they can be.
Nice. Lot, you're next up on my list. And then Leah, you're after that.
Right. Okay. So my name is Lot Haig, and I live in Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And I was only recently, a few months ago, introduced to appreciative inquiry. I took a course, and then the facilitator there pointed me to this meeting, and I was very excited because I love like the relational stuff, and end of life, everything concerning end of life is so important, I think, and the more we can relate in a connected way, the better it is. So I'm very curious to hear more about your work and to exchange. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Leah from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. 20 years ago, I had my master on PTSD, Holocaust survivors, and I worked a lot about loss. And then I had for a while I stopped, and I'm returning like a year from now. And I joined here because I want to have more conversations to hear what is on now. That's why.
Nice. Jean, and then Kane.
I'm Jean Hartman. I am located in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in the US. I lost my brother to cancer 20 years ago, I think, and I'm currently caring for my mother as an aging parent. I think for me, there's kind of that personal pull, in terms of the topic, and certainly the use of appreciative inquiry, very nice way to develop the connectiveness. I didn't have a chance to do that with my brother. So I think really, like in the moment as everyone's talking about this, and I'm a practitioner in organization development with nonprofits. And so this idea of applying appreciative inquiry, if that's the foundation to be able to talk about these topics and these very personal topics, I think it's a very heartwarming way to approach it, and I want to learn how to shift and do that for myself. So I'm here for that. So self-care, I think right now is my entry point into this.
Nice. Great. Kane, then Susan, then Mary.
So I'm very happy to be here. Kane Phelps in Pacific Palisades, California. I've got a number of divergent reasons for being here. I'm a therapist, and I specialize in geriatric end-of-life issues. I had a career as a social worker for 27 years, and then I've been a licensed therapist in private practice for the last 5. I worked volunteer work in hospice and in grief and loss counseling, both of those arenas. I suppose probably my heartfelt connection to this comes in part because I lost my parents at a young age, both parents, and I wasn't really there for either of them when they passed. So I feel a bit of a missionary zeal about. And I worked for 27 years as a social worker in the child welfare system, and there was just so much stress and so much bureaucracy involved in that was really quite unpalatable. And when I quote unquote retired, I wasn't thinking of it as retiring, but transitioned and was working with the hospice work. I mean, the shift in the heartfelt connection with people, with the professionals who were working in that field, was very inspiring to me. It was a huge shift. And it felt like the people who were working with the dying were, I don't know, much. There was a joy to the word. It was, and I always felt kind of like an interesting thing where where babies are born, in the pediatric hospital setting, the joy that the nurses have in those hospital settings was comparable to me to the kind of feeling that I've gotten from hospice workers as well. Interesting kind of parallel.
Yeah, amazing. You'll have some great insights to share. And I know Joan also did some hospice work, and deep and meaningful. Thank you for joining. Susan.
Unmute. Susan, you need to unmute the microphone. Bottom left.
Am I okay now?
Yes.
Yes.
Hearing you.
Yeah. My name is Susan Madison. I'm a primary care physician, retired for the last 5 years, and from both practice, and I was a medical educator doing my 55 years of practice. And I am part of a volunteer faculty member of the Eastside Institute, which is we relate to the Taos Institute. We're a community of conversations, I guess I would call it. And the whole issue of death and dying, I think it was just started when I was very young in my training. I trained at Memorial Sloan Kettering for part of my internship and residency before Kubler-Ross. And just at that time, it was just excruciating. Even then, when I hadn't been thinking about these issues, to work with people and never be told we could not talk to people, that they might be dying, that they had a terminal illness, that even the cancer word was kind of obscured. You have a condition. So it's been an issue that I've kind of been thinking about all throughout my practice. And I realized that, in some ways, these are not easy conversations to have unless you've created the environment. So patients of mine and it was primarily in the cancer field, once I kind of turned over I didn't turn over their care, I continued to be their primary care physician, but they were in the medicalized model. It was very hard to step back and say, well, do you want to consider another way of living your life during this period with cancer, other than, the extreme medicalization and protocol after protocol. It felt undermining almost from what, because people aren't working together around this issue. Within the profession, I think you don't have those kind of collaborative conversations about how are we going to work with our patients and create an environment for them to actually have some agency around this. So I think that's what, and I'm working since retirement. I've been working partly because of personal reasons, my family, friends, working very closely in the arena of dementia and memory loss. And there, the end of life decisions are it's very interesting because, it raises, when do people not have agency? And people, I think what really horrified me, I read an article in the New York Times about 4 years ago, that people who had early dementia signed end of life directives. They didn't want any of that. And then these were being invalidated because they, quotes, no longer had capacity. So I think it's a very, very interesting issue. And then I think I spoke to on the conversation this week, made me think about how dualistic we are in thinking about you're either getting medical care or you're, quotes, doing nothing, or you're going on another road. And it just seems that's such an artificial distinction. And I've been working with, friends who I've been friends with for 35 years and influenced on my idea of process, the death, who still say, no, hospice, that's got too much baggage. It's enough as to you're giving up. So I just find this conversation so important because I think it affects so many people in a way that doesn't allow them to really have the experience of controlling this in some way.
Yep. Well, thanks for joining us, Susan.
Thank you.
I think I'm left.
Yep.
My name's Mary Vargas. I live in San Francisco, and I'm here for a couple of reasons. Primary is that I do work with Tony, and it's hard for me to draw the distinction because healthcare is corporate too, but in the corporate world, I'm trying to figure out how to reconcile both, because healthcare is a business where they need leadership. But this is just such an important conversation, and I feel like there are a lot of people out there who realize how important the conversation is, and yet when I talk to lots of different kinds of people, that message still isn't getting out there and not getting across, and they still don't know how to do it. And they say, oh yes, how important the work is that you're doing. So I think the more we come together and the more we share ideas and perspectives, the more we can get it out there.
Thank you. Good to see you. And Joan, do you just want to?
I'm ready to introduce myself. I just want to
Nice.
everybody else.
Perfect.
And I'm really pleased to hear all the different conversations that you've all discussed. My own life has been, I don't know how it happened, but well, it did. I was getting divorced, and I thought of that as end of a life when Kubler-Ross's books first came out. So that was in the late 60s, early 70s. And so the whole end of life, whether it be the whole life or a part of life, has really been fascinating for me. And I worked in hospice, local, when I say worked, I mean I was on the board. And then my parents died in the 90s. And that was one of the most life-changing events I've had, because it was beautiful. It was loving. It absolutely changed my perspective on death and dying. It was a time when there were no barriers to loving. Not that we'd had a contentious relationship, but it hadn't been intimate in terms of talking before. And there was just something that was so freeing about, I mean, truly they were at end of life. The other piece about hospice, and I have just spent the last 5 years not doing much professionally, sort of, and I'm grieving now, which when you talk about grief, sometimes your brain is just like not on. And man, am I experiencing that. So that's why I was a little late this morning. I forgot it was Friday. That whole issue of grief just shifting. And it was, I had a love for the best love of my life I met when I was 70, and he just died a year ago, less than a year ago, of cancer. And my aunt, who was almost 99, died 2 weeks before he was diagnosed. So I've spent the last 5 years really doing this and having these conversations. And I think when we think about these conversations, it really helps if we realize that they're not so much apart, that if we are tuned in, they're really a part of life, well, for a long time at least. And I know that with my aunt, who was scared to death of dying, and I used to visit her. She was in Delaware, I was in Maine. I've just moved back to Maine. You may see some boxes behind me. She didn't want to talk about death, and yet it kept coming up in conversations. And we could then ask a question about something she had said. And that was such an easy way. You know, we talk about questions, and we've got some really good questions about how you start a conversation. But sometimes if you just listen to people long enough, you'll hear them say things that are little doorways into these deeper conversations. And then we ask an appreciative question and make sure it's appreciative, and it really opens up the conversation. So that's all I'll say for now.
All right. And I guess I'll introduce myself a little bit. I really appreciated, Dawn, your intro of me, because I do identify primarily as a a business consultant, appreciative inquiry consultant working in strategy, innovation, leadership, and culture. And I often say I'm an accidental author, so I never intended to write a book on end-of-life conversations or healing conversations. It would never have come to be on the top of the list of what I thought I would write about, but it was the book that was called to be written when my, even though I would consider myself a youngster, and I'll still consider myself a youngster when I'm 90, that I have a lot of experience with death and dying. I lost a sister when I was in my 20s and she was in her mid 20s. I lost both of my parents when I was in my 40s. And a lot of the lessons that I've learned have been by this personal journey. And the start of the book, as I stated in the online forum, happened when my mom was going back and forth to the hospital more and more frequently. And even though, I work with appreciative inquiry every day with organizations, when you're in the problem, it's hard to figure out a way out and how to start. And, some of the big insights that we talk about a lot is it's more important to figure out what to ask than what to say, which is a blinding flash of the obvious. But it's so important. It's more important to figure out what to ask than what to say, because a lot of times these conversations don't happen because we don't know just the right thing to say to the person to connect, meet them where they're at. So it stops us from actually engaging in those important conversations. So the AI questions are perfect around the open-ended, positively biased questions that invite stories is the way in, and figuring out what are you curious to know about them, what are your hopes for the conversation, and crafting a question or a conversation starter that lets you into that conversation, as Joan mentioned, and it flows from there naturally. So I have one big interest in how do we help more people have these conversations, because guess what? It's not around the dinner table or in our normal spaces in our lives to just bring up death and dying. And those that have worked or do work in healthcare know that that's where the conversations are happening, a lot of times after a critical incident. And maybe not as much with the family. And then there's all of this work around the details and logistics of healthcare proxies, power of attorney, living wills, blah, 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 and less about the experience of end of life and dying. So big interest there. And the other interest is as a business consultant in what I would call being an innovation junkie, is our healthcare system is not designed for aging and end of life. I think I put just a little blurb in there about how a lot of our healthcare system is about compliance, safety, clinical care and treatment, safety, and not around the things that we found in the research that are most important around the social, emotional, relational, around quality of life, around independence and choice, around purpose, meaning, satisfaction. These are the things that start to emerge as more important. And as I was chatting with Susan, we're sort of woefully underprepared, or our systems aren't designed around those principles. So that's a little bit about me. And as I said, we had some questions that prompted the online dialogue. And as much as I'd like to say we got through all of these questions, it was sort of people connecting where they were at. And one thing that I think might be helpful is if the folks that participated, I see there's Joan, Mark, Susan, just shared some of the highlights that came out of our week's dialogue to bring people up to speed and to see if they have something to add there. Does that work for everyone? Yeah? Okay. So Mark, Susan, Joan, feel free to unmute, and it would be great just to hear some of your takeaway or the key topics that we talked about during the week.
Thanks, Tony. So I guess some of the questions that I'm sort of left with now after our conversation online is related to how to find this balance between what I might want in a relationship and what other person may want in the relationship, and trying to find a way of respecting these things inside the relationship. So I think there are some people who don't place the same sort of value on dialogue that many people in this group might. And that can be, well, in my experience, it can be very frustrating, and it's hard to decide if that is a problem on my side, a problem on the other side, or it's just simply not a problem. And I think that's an interesting space to explore, and I enjoyed some of the banter we had, which sort of just raises those questions and makes it much more of a conscious thing I can think about now that we've sort of got it on paper. So thanks for that.
Are you finished, Mark?
Yeah.
Because what you're saying is so interesting to me, as it was reading. I really appreciate all you wrote. Thank you. Maybe it's not a question of whether the other person verbalizes or acts as if they appreciate dialogue, because they may not have had the experience. And what I think about is my aunt, who was certainly not somebody you would ever think would ever participate in any kind of dialogue. And she had her opinions, and that was it. There wasn't any dialogue about it. And yet, by listening to her and asking questions about what she said, led us down this path. I think I wrote, it's in the book too. One day she said, I don't understand it. And we always talk about death. And this was sitting around usually the breakfast table or the dinner table. Over 20 years we're talking about it now. We're not talking about when she was closer to dying. And so it didn't really matter whether she could say, I want to participate in dialogue, but it was that there's something, I think, within us that wants to connect. And how we defined healing was lessening the separation and the isolation. So one of Tony's questions was, how do you define healing? And the way we defined it when we were writing the book was lessening separation. And so sometimes just inviting people to have a conversation by building on what they've said and asking questions is a way to really move into a dialogue that the person may not even put that name on it. The name doesn't matter. So that's my thought about dialogue and whether or not you call it that.
My audio. Okay, I'm unmuting. I think with the conversations about relations, it made me think about, it's both. I totally agree with you, Joan, that you build and you continue to be curious in terms of where you can go with the question. And I also felt very strongly about my desire for people to have a more intimate, conversational, close to death. And over the years, I had to just radically accept who people were. And some people were loners, and that was kind of where they were. And I found it painful. And I remember going to social therapy with Fred Newman, who developed social therapy, very shortly after doing the process when a very close friend of mine was dying, and she was a loner, and I was crying. I was so upset how this was going down, and she had cancer. And he said, people aren't going to make these huge life transformations. You have to accept who people are in life and build from there. So it really made me think about that, because I've had a few people who I've worked with say, I want to have a different kind of death than what I lived as. You know, one woman that actually I worked with for 3 years in trying to create the kind of process in her life, how she wanted to live her life that was different, that she was making some radical changes in being intimate, more intimate with people. So I made me think about the how you can do this. But I think your recommendation to be absolutely curious about everything people are giving you to build with that is so important.
I connected deeply with Mark's, some of his initial observation, especially as he started to describe this person that was born before the 1950s. And I thought, you know, my dad was pretty much from just around the silent generation. So there weren't deep conversations about the meaning of life or death or any of those things. And what I really enjoyed was the different perspectives on what dialogue conversations meant or looked like. Because even though we talk about open-ended, positively biased questions that invite stories, the notion of an actual conversation, some of the other forms of engaging were in silence, just being present with the person, and listening, not necessarily prompting the question, but sort of going with the conversation. And as Joan mentioned, it might open up a doorway to ask a question. And it might not be specifically about death or dying. It just helps you get to understand the other person's perspective better. So I found that conversation extremely generative. And then I'm trying to remember the woman that joined in that said, in any conversation, there's 4 people in the conversation. There's you, the other person, and what were the other 2? How were those described? It was
I don't remember, but I think that's the person I was just thinking of before you spoke, who
Yeah.
said that
I'll
sometimes
find it.
listening to yourself, the kind of one's the you who's talking and the one who's listening to you, your own self, and that you learn things just by hearing you talk.
I found it. It's Andrea from Bolivia. Perhaps the best way of putting some order on your thoughts and your feelings and keep yourself open to others is having a conversation. And a conversation between 2 persons always ends up having 4 persons, you and the other. But during the conversation, both found a newer version of yourself. You learn something of the other, but also of you. You hear yourself and then you heal. Usually the other person is only a co-constructor of the bridge with the invitation of a trusting and crossing over. She apologizes for her English, but that was just beautifully said.
And I wonder who here hasn't learned more about themselves just by verbalizing and having a conversation, as well as about the other person.
I think so. I don't know if we want to share any more about the online conversation. What I think might be most appropriate is just to see where might you want Joan and I to dive a little bit deeper into healing conversations, or what questions are with you right now? Like I captured Mark's question about, you know, the notion of how do we placing the value on the dialogue, or if people don't, and we can continue that conversation. But are there specific questions that you would like to explore? You can either unmute yourself or put them in the comment box.
I tell you, I had a question that I sort of was getting to, is just how do we think about, as people who are, you know, interested in having these conversations, how do we think about the more, you know, reified, categorized way documents and instruments that are presented to people in end of life, like the healthcare proxies, advanced directives, DNRs, and now there's, you know, it gets more and more complicated, the layers of these things. And just how do we sort of work with those, or see those as some ways part of our conversation, use them, make them more, because they are so over-determining at some point
Mm.
how the process is going to go.
Yeah.
Do you have some answers to your own questions, Susan?
Nice, Joan.
What I said was, do you have some answers to your own questions? Because having been in the medical field, you may have had a lot more experience with those documents and presenting them than any of the rest of us on the call.
I mean, what I could say is my experience with those are to try and de-reify them or de-thingify them and see them as part of a process and probably maybe a starting point for a conversation as opposed to a definitive endpoint. Like, have people heard of these things? What do they think about them? And realize that they are completely determined by that moment in the illness as opposed to a document that's giving a roadmap for the rest of one's life.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand that last point you made.
Well, I worked very closely with Fred Newman, the late Fred Newman, who founded the Institute, doing a 10-year, very complicated, long illness. And every time he went to the hospital, the DNR was presented, and we had a different feeling about it.
Hmm.
Yeah. So that's all. It wasn't. If you're signing the DNR today, it doesn't mean in 6 months it's the same document. You might have, it's going to give you it's not a definitive map for the rest of your life, I was saying, but it's in some ways something you want to discuss as what is part of this process now.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's clear.
Because I see Mary and Lot have their hands up. So Mary and then Lot.
So, Susan, I totally agree. And I think it has so many different levels of need. I was hospitalized in April. And one of the first questions was, do you have an advanced, I was admitted through the ER, and then they didn't ask me anything there. And when I got assigned a room, the nurse, one of the first things, there's a computer by the bed, and she said, she was going through a checklist, it seemed. And she said, do you have an advanced directive? And I said, oh, I do. But it's not part of my medical record, not yet. And that was all she asked. And then there was an admitting person who was a clearly non-medical person who appeared with an iPad, and her, after asking me if I could pay,
Of course.
she asked if I had an advanced directive. And then that's as far as the conversation went. And I knew I wasn't going to die. So I said, yeah, if anything bad happens, hook me up. I'm only 53. I want to live. I want to, be around a little more. So the conversation was, I could easily say that and a little bit see the humor in it, because they were so unprepared to have any more of a conversation. It's in their checklist, but they don't quite know what to do with it. And so we've begun to integrate it into the medicalized model, but it's woefully insufficient.
Mm.
And so, but then the other question, kind of what we're looking at here is, what about all the people before we get to that question? Like, even thinking about who is it that's prompting us, the society, to have an advanced directive? How are we having the conversation about the need for that? And that can come from so many other sources, not just your primary care physician. Because like my relationship with my primary care physician, I'm switching. She's my second one. She doesn't listen. She doesn't seem to care. Why would I have that conversation with her? So I'm looking for someone who can actually listen, but I think we can have that conversation outside the doctor's office too.
Nice. Loot, you had something to share as well?
No, I was just wondering what an advanced directive means.
It's one of many documents, but here
in the U.S.
Yeah, it basically defines your wishes for end of life care and what you would like, and it depends on the state in the United States. Other things it could be called or the forms it could take, but in the end, it basically says, here's what I want, and then often there's something called a power of attorney, which gives a person other than yourself the power to make decisions for you if you're not able. So there are several things that kind of come together.
Yeah.
There's a lot of these things that are confusing just in the checklisty kind of thing, whether it's called a healthcare proxy, power of attorney, living will, advanced directives. So there's a ton of those things that, as Mary and others have said, are in our medicalized world. The thing from the innovation side of things in transforming our healthcare system, one, to be more relational, I think we need to shift the structures in which these conversations happen. Like Mary said, you don't want, the payment, not just the payment or death conversation as your first interaction with a healthcare institution. If you're going to have that inside of an institution, you want to have it inside of a structure that makes sense. So, and when my dad was in long-term care, there's a structure called a family meeting. There are family meeting structures where the coordinated care team or caregivers of different specialties come together with the patient, the resident, and family members to have different conversations. To me, it seems like get it out of a checklist and get it into a conversation in a family meeting about goals of care, about goals of end of life treatment, about what Atul Gawande says, what matters most in the end, and those things that are important, what you want done or don't want done to maintain your dignity, quality of life, humanness. So I think that's one piece, is we need to intervene directly to make our medical systems more relational and human. And then there's the whole, and there are things like from the Conversation Project. I don't know if any of you know the Conversation Project. It's about trying to get people to share their end of life wishes, or I would like my end of life to be, fill in the blank. And they've started to introduce this notion through IHI, these conversation nurses. Again, it's a skill set that not just doctors need, it's doctors, nurses, and in fact, a lot of times nurses are the one that have the much stronger relationship with the patients in an ongoing way. So I start thinking about the medical education that needs to shift for all of those going into healthcare to be more versed at supporting these conversations, because anywhere along the, from being a child to having some critical incident to a serious diagnosis to aging and end of life, there are opportunities to have these meaningful and powerful conversations that make it clear what you want. So that's my 2 cents. I'm sticking to it.
And I'm wondering, for those of you who are from other countries,
yeah,
is there something comparable, or you don't know,
or it's probably handled a lot better already?
Tony and Joan, I think this is a really interesting conversation, but it might be slipping into the dimension of the materialistic and bureaucratic aspects of dying, which we all don't want to focus on. But Tony, when I was listening to you, something which came to my mind is, I was thinking, well, why are these conversations connected with a medical institution at all? And it's probably somewhat related to the way that we deal with death inside of the culture more
Yep.
largely, right? So, and the idea that came to mind was saying, well, you know, when where in the society can you actually get a handle on everyone and give them a common message? And that would be at school. So let's imagine, you know, like every child pretty much going to be at school when they're around 16. So why don't we have every single child prepare that statement of what they want to happen if they end up being, you know, in a terrible accident or passing away or something, you know, tomorrow. And so they actually can have that discussion and get children engaged in the discussion of actually, you know, let's talk about the fact that you really do die, rather than waiting until you're in that, you know, latter care, if you're lucky enough to get that clear.
Love it. There aren't as many, I mean, school is one of those institutions, but I think, like I said at the beginning, Joan and I wrote this book for individuals and family members to have these conversations. It's just not, you know, they talk about taxes and death are the only certainties in life. So, you know, they have these healthcare conversations, but again, it's more focused on the logistics side of it. I'm heartened by some of the other people that are intentionally trying to create structures in our culture, and maybe we're just, you know, not as hip and up to other non-Western cultures, but there's death cafes that came out of London. There's let's have dinner and talk about death as forums to bring people together to have these kinds of conversations. And there's a number of things that are starting to pop up, but I like bringing it into our education system. I wish Kristen Bodiford was here because there's the whole aspect of the work that they do around intergenerativity and how do we enable these conversations, like you say, not just to happen in the school system, but across generations so that it's, you know, the younger and older generations are having these conversations.
Tony and Joan, to kind of maybe shift a little bit,
Yes.
I would love for you to share some of your stories from the book and some examples of kinds of conversations that you've had, what happened within them, the relational process that was happening. I mean, I think I learned so much from stories.
Nice.
Yep.
Joan, you first.
You share, yeah.
Oh, gee, let's see. Which of the stories? Where to start? Are you talking about our own stories or stories in the book or both?
Either, both, you know.
I don't know why, but what's coming to me now is a friend who lived in a family that was very close. And then at some point, the uncle distanced himself from the family. And this woman, her name is Lucille, was devastated. She was relatively young. And for decades, they didn't really hear from him. And when her mother died, I think he may have sent a card, but he didn't do anything. And for some reason, at some point, she decided she really could not just let this go. And took her a while. She found this phone number. She was on the East Coast. He was then on the West Coast. And his daughter answered the phone, and he was in a home at that point. And she had made the assumption that he didn't want, you know, it had been so long that he was just disinterested. He was still, the family was cut off. And the daughter said, "Oh, Lucille, he talks about you all the time. He's just too embarrassed to call, or he doesn't know how to start the conversation." And so she actually called, and she's not somebody who does things spontaneously. This is a little judgmental. She's also oftentimes is not real generous with just spending money. And yet it was so important to her. She got on a plane and she went out to see him in the home. And for the first time, she found out later, he went outside. She got him in a wheelchair. He went outside. He was alive and laughing. And he was able to say, "I am so sorry. I have wanted to make contact for so many years, and I just didn't know how." And she was, she had been left with her assumptions of did he or didn't he? And the only way to find out was to call. And she found that her assumption that he had, well, she knew he dismissed the family for a while, but that he was still there was totally wrong. And he and she just had this lovely time until the time of his death. So that's a story of, we think people don't want dialogue or even contact, and yet this was what he'd been wanting for so long. And he died actually shortly after she went out to see him. It was as though he were finally at peace, and it finished that last piece. But he couldn't ask for it.
And that was in that chapter around finding peace and acceptance and unfinished business. So just so you know, sort of the flow of the book and the chapters are based on sort of the stories that we captured and the types of questions and conversations, from getting to know them better to enhancing and mending relationships to after a serious diagnosis, finding peace and acceptance and loving them goodbye. So we've got stories and questions and conversation starters along each of those dimensions. So one of the stories, and this came up in our online dialogue.
Tony, you went silent.
I went silent. I just saw that. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So the story that I'm going to share, I think, is an important one. It's a subtitle of our book. It's about enhancing or mending relationships. And I had a lot of interesting family dynamics, as we all do. And this one was about facilitating someone else's healing conversation. And this is the story about my sister. My sister and my mom did not have the best relationship, and this happens in many families, so it's not an uncommon tale. My sister, I would say, wanted closure, and my mom wanted closeness and be closer to my sister and the kids. And what prompted this is, like I mentioned earlier, one of my sisters passed away when she was 26. As my mom was nearing her end of life, I didn't want my sister to have regrets, because what happens, you can either have conversations before they die, or you can pay a lot in therapy after they're gone to try to resolve unresolved issues. So for me, it's a little bit easier to think we should be spending much more time and resources in actually having these conversations, finishing unfinished business, having the conversations that are important, finding forgiveness within ourselves and of others. So I didn't want my sister to have regrets. So I actually crafted some AI questions for my sister. I know it's kind of bold. It's like, intervening on my sister's life and saying, here are some questions. But the reason that I did that is because in the past, she had sent a few letters to my mom and dad. And the sort of one-way judgmentally filled about why didn't you or what happened, there's no chance for dialogue or conversation in a one-way letter. So I tried to create some open-ended, positively biased questions that would help them better understand each other, their stories, their journeys. And I'm just going to read this little piece, because after I sent that email with some questions, my sister sent me back a note. It says, your questions are all good ones, so thank you for thinking through them. Unfortunately, I think they're just a bit too late for where I am. To be honest, I'm not looking for renewed connection with mom, but I suppose some sort of closure might be a good idea. I know it's not what you want to hear, but it's just how it is. I don't want to bear a grudge in my heart any longer, but I have moved on through sheer hard work and determination to survive. I don't feel good about her or the childhood I did or didn't have. I wish I could make a difference, but I can't. Who knows how I'll feel after I see her, but I don't want her or you to be disappointed. So, yeah. I mean, the main thing is all I could do is put some questions out there and let go of any of the expectations of their relationship or their conversation, just opening the door for this possibility to happen. And then there was like, she had the conversation. I don't know exactly what they talked about, because I wasn't in the room with them. But immediately after the visit, she didn't share too many of the details. but she sent me a note. Sounds like mom is getting a little bit more ready to let go. I can't believe how hard she has fought. Amazing, really, but not surprising. I think that I have that piece of her in me, the real fighter, for good and bad. I was also thinking I should call her. Can you send me her phone number, please? So this was just a couple months later. So so this is helping her to get closure, but it's also bringing what my mom was hoping for, closeness with my sister. And it says, by the way, I'll send along some pictures and a note from mom that you can print. I'm sure even if you print them at home, she'll be happy. So again, we never know the impact of the conversations or the ripples, or where, Mark, as we were talking about, where that satisfaction or shifts will happen in ourselves and in others. But that's just sort of the bread and butter of healing conversations to me, as it gives us an opportunity to make the most of that time. And obviously folks like Sherry Torres and Jackie Stavros with their book about these important conversations, or conversations that matter, takes it back even a step further. So I don't know if that's what you had in mind, but that's the story that stood out for me, Don.
I've got a friend whose mother's in hospice right now, and I talked with her yesterday just briefly about how things were going, and her mother is unable to speak, pretty much can't walk, just really, closed out to the world. And so she's trying to find ways to connect with her mother in these last few days, and she's finding touch to be a really powerful way to connect. And I was telling her about the video, and many of you may have seen it. Gladys, it's a YouTube video about a woman with Alzheimer who had somebody come and visit her from the, what's it called? I can't remember what group it's called.
Is it with music?
With music, and she ends up singing some songs with this woman, and touching the woman, and and it totally makes a connection, and the woman just reaches out and pulls the visitor who's singing, pulls her towards her. For the first time, she's had a human connection with somebody in her last days. And so I think that's so important too. We can have these conversations, but sometimes when we can't have verbal conversations, there's other ways to communicate through touch and music and just being present.
Dawn, you make me think. I just joined an organization called the Threshold Choir, and it's like my 2-hour singing meditation every Monday night in rehearsal. It's just beautiful. And there are hundreds of these beautiful songs that have been written mostly by members, but not all. And now it's an international organization. I think it was founded in 2008 by a woman here in the Bay Area. But they sing at the bedside, and mostly in hospice organizations, but also at home if they get a request. And it's really, there's a range of ages from, I'd say, 30s to, last rehearsal, one woman had to be in her 80s. So there's this huge range, and it's just lovely. 3-part harmony a cappella, and it's really wonderful.
The question that I have right now on my mind is the fact that, so there's 10 of us on this call or something. I'm curious as to how many of us have actually had these conversations with our own loved ones versus thinking about how do we have these with those people out there, or how to engage people. Like, I don't know how many of you have actually started to engage in the conversation about aging, end of life, what you want your end of life to be, what your hopes are for your own good death. Have you had, has anyone been involved in that, and what's your experience that you would like to share about that? Jean, it looks like you're ready to, I think, I see you.
So I think what comes to me in this conversation most is about the quality of aging, and I've been sitting with this thought, for myself and for my aging mother. And I think what I want to share, just as a form of participation, is that I can't speak with my mother. I can't have a conversation with her that satisfies me, but that's sufficient for her. And so I think my lesson and part of coming onto this call is, I want some form of validation, is that I just I let go of the need that I have to have that quality conversation that constitute quality of aging. I think to have quality of aging, I need to begin to have these conversations. But in fact, my husband doesn't want to talk about it.
See, this is it. This is the challenge, right?
Yeah. I mean,
even if you're ready to talk about it, other people may not be.
Right. And like if we were in a practice setting, as an OD practitioner, of course, when I'm involved in succession planning discussion, which is the closest thing to like a dying, sort of a death for CEOs, C-level people, when they think about succession, I think it mirrors that. And they're not going to have it until they're ready, and they'll defer it for as long as they have to until they get hit by a bus. So I'm being humorous here a little bit, but just to bring it back for myself is, my husband doesn't want to talk about it. My mom's not able to talk about it. So then I'm kind of like stuck in the middle. And then what has to change, I think, just for my daily peace, is to say, well, maybe there's I can let go of the need to have that with my mom. I can wait for my husband until he's ready. But in the meantime, what do I do for myself? And then one thing I want to just...
Sounds like a compromise, by the way, just saying.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I don't know for now if I need to, be more forceful. And maybe that gives me peace for now, just that it's in the front of my mind. And I think one thing I do want to offer, and love to have feedback if others have experience. I've found that I'm having conversations through the caregiver that I've hired to take care of mom. Mom has developed a connectedness with her that, she might as well be the daughter. And there's no sense of jealousy, but there's a sense of peace for me that my mom has that from a human being, because in fact I can't give it to her. And so if really she doesn't have any need of talking about what will it be like, what does she want, but really just giving her a quality of aging that is offered through sort of non-communication, and maybe communicating with me is just stressful for her. And so I'm needing to process and accept that. And I'm okay with that, I think. So thank you.
It looks like Joan and Mark have a couple of thoughts on that. This was a big conversation in our online forum about roles and context of conversations. So I'd love to hear Mark, Joan, anyone else that has a thought on this as well.
Well, Jean, I had been wondering about you, since you talked about you also have a brother who's dying, all through this conversation. And first, I think what I most want to say to you is your ability to accept your mom where she is very healing. And I also hear you say you think that you can accept. What I would wonder is, first of all, if you're clear what you need from your mom, and also just be aware that your willingness to let her be who she is is really important. A story. I have an aunt who actually told me that she worked really hard not to love me. Start there. Mainly because my mother had left their religion, and so therefore I was not the same religion. It had nothing to do with me, from what she said. So you can imagine there wasn't, and she was of that age long before born, 1950. So the conversations oftentimes were kind of light. And yet, when I could just let them be what they were, with the intention that whenever there was an opportunity, I'd keep my Susan called it curiosity, and my ear open to just take it not a foot deeper, but a millimeter deeper. And I was surprised at the end. We had some, like she did tell me she saw her parents were there every day, which I believe is true. And if you read Final Gifts, which is one of my favorite books, and it talks about people coming and people who were there, who are no longer in body, being present. So she told me about that. And we could talk about, well, you and I have different beliefs. But, I remember one conversation was, I said, I know you and I have different beliefs about what happens when you die, because she was very clear. You go in the ground and the worms eat you, which wasn't real appealing to me. And I'm a spiritual person, so that wasn't at all what I believed. And I told her about people coming back and talking to you and having connections. But I said to her, so if when you do pass, which was going to be soon, you find that you could communicate with me, would you do that? And I was shocked. She looked at me with this kind of twinkle in her eye and said, sure. And I thought, yeah, I bet that'll be the day. And I'll be darned. She died on a Saturday morning. And the morning of her service, my alarm clock went off. And I had always had it by my bed because I was waiting for her caregiver to call me. And I looked at it, it hadn't been set. So I turned it off. An hour later, it went off, exactly an hour later, it went off again. And I thought, isn't that interesting? And so my own belief system is that indeed, when she got there, she found that things were a little different than she had expected, thank heavens, and that she was communicating with me. But boy, for her to have said that when she was still alive, no, we just had, there was, and she worked, to not love me. And I was her major emotional and spiritual caregiver at the end, which I thought was kind of fun and ironic. But I really had to know that that was who she was. And I could want, but not expect. And when I could be there without expectations and could really put my wants and desires somewhere else and maybe talk about it with my friends, she was freer. Because I think the expectations, whether spoken or not, are communicated. And I don't know about you, but I'm real rebellious. And if you expect something on me, I may not do it. But if you give me an opportunity, well, I might be coaxed out. So I hope you're able to have more and more conversations of whatever kind with your mom and your brother too.
We have around 10 minutes left, and I want to make sure that if there's like Kane and Leah, if there's things that are on your mind that you would like to share or a question, would love to hear it before we wrap up.
Right.
Time is flying by.
Yes, Joan has asked about cultural differences.
Yes.
And here is very different. We don't talk about that. It is like for Jean here, I wanted to talk about that with my mom, and she couldn't have one word. And I understood that that's it. And with my father, that he was from, he came from Auschwitz, and I worked about trauma, and I learned in many, many places that we have to be glad with less. It was not possible to talk to those kind of people. So I learned that is I learned also with my students that they were very, very glad to be talking about, very appreciative to open this kind of conversations. I don't know with whom they could talk, but mainly with themselves. It was very good, yes. So, when Tony talked about the medical school, I work with radiologists talking about the bad news about cancer, and I saw that they ran. It was very, very hard to talk about this kind of thing with whoever, not only with the clients, that was somehow prohibited for them, but with us or with them. So that with the medical school, I think would be in their training to be talked about.
Yeah. I mean, I had the good fortune of teaching at Brown second year med students on delivering bad news. It's a course that they talk about. How do you deliver bad news?
Right.
They also have a course around family meetings. They also have, so there's different segments that could be integrated throughout our medical education. So hopeful.
Yeah.
Kane, jump on in. What's in your heart, your mind?
Well, just appreciating everything that's been said. I just this particular arena is such a rich one, and I lead or facilitate a group, the title of which is Positive Aging, and actually next week I announced that and I choose the topic from week to week. And the topic next week is death. So this has been a very appropriate gathering. And just the idea of opening up a conversation. I think that's such a wonderful, and being in California, I feel privileged, of course, because I think there's a lot more going on here. Mary, you mentioned the choirs and the death cafes. You mentioned, Tony, that I've participated in both of those types of things, which are such a enhancement to the whole concept of a positive dying experience. I mean, I just think that alone is kind of revolutionary. The idea that you can have and create for yourself a positive dying experience, And I'd like to. I'm kind of enthused about really carrying the banner for that.
I love it. And Dawn put in the chat box that there's the Positive Aging newsletter put out by Ken and Mary Gergen. If you don't know about it, you should definitely sign up and check it out. I love that notion of it's the topic for your positive aging group. And I think some of the stuff either on the Death Cafe website or the Let's Talk About Death Over Dinner, they get to some of the same things. It gets to what's your definition of a good death? And it's not like a good death as you think about it for others, but for yourself. What does it mean? What do you want your end of life to look like? And, so they're easy questions to answer. It's just taking the courage and guts to bringing together a group of people that can talk about it, because we don't have those forums just to have it. But sometimes it's just nice. The British are the best. They make not fun of it, but they make light of it. That makes it easier to get into such a taboo topic. Like I like the one group out of London that has a hashtag that says YODO, instead of YOLO, you only die once. So it's like, they make fun of these kinds of things that make it light and easy to enter.
No, I was wondering if any of you, listening to all your stories the whole time, I'm wondering, are you familiar with the book of Stephen Levine, A Year to Live?
Oh, yes.
I'm not. A
Because
Year
that
to
is
Live?
such a beautiful book. This was a former Buddhist teacher, and he imagined what would it look like if I have a year to live. And
that's
then
beautiful.
I think with a couple of loved ones, really, I'm not sure now. He might have done it just for himself, and just lived this year as if it was his last one. And he wrote it years ago, and he only recently passed. But and over the world, groups of people have done that, and I've also done it for a half a year with a couple of friends, and we just got together every few weeks and just exchanged what is it that we want to do, and not in terms of, you know, my bucket list and, you know, I want to see this film, but real, you know, the real topics, you know, concern us. And that was really good.
Who's the author?
Stephen Levine. I think
I totally want to do this.
Levine.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
You will find it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's great.
I was thinking the popularity of Gawande's book, Being Mortal. I mean,
Yes.
It's on the bestseller list for what, 5 years or 4 years or something like that. There is definitely an extraordinary interest in this, you know. I think there's still a lot of difficulty in having the conversations, but I think on that side, many people want to have these conversations.
One of my favorite people, Mary and I, when we were out at one of the aging conferences, like to show this guy. His name is Z-Dog MD. He's a doctor. He considers himself a slightly off-white rapper, and he talks about our medical system. And he has a song called "Ain't No Way to Die." But again, it's a way of doing a rap and a song that points out the blinding obvious in our healthcare system in a fun way that connects with the millennials. Again, you know, Atul Gawande, I love it, but it's not going to necessarily have 8 million views on YouTube or whatever, you know what I'm saying?
And every time that we've shown that video, when we've presented at a conference, the age spectrum in the room is pretty wide.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody was like, wow, that's great. I mean, we've never had a negative response to it.
I'm going to put it.
Say what video you were talking about?
I'm putting it in the chat box right now. So it's Z-Dog with 2 G's, and look for Ain't
No Way to Die. Yeah. And he has a page on his website. I think it's called The Conversation. And it's on there.
Yeah. It's awesome.
All right,
I need to
we're
turn
going
it
to
back
wrap
over.
up here.
Exactly. Thanks, Don.
Unless there's one last comment, but we do need to close up about the call today. Any last word?
Dawn, I sometimes wonder, can you leave the call on or not?
You mean for people just to stay on if they want to?
Yeah.
Well, how many people want to stay on?
Because I would love to ask a lot more about the experience she had. It really fascinates me, and we don't have time. But if you'd be willing to spend another 5 minutes and talk about that more, I'd love to hear.
Oh, I would, but I'm sorry that I need to go now. I have another meeting. But I would love to exchange with you if you give me your...
Can everybody, if people want to stay connected, you can put your email in the chat and just look for whatever email you want. We'll just do this for the next couple minutes.
Dawn, I've been caught out with the chat because I think when you end the Zoom, the chat disappears.
Oh, right. But we can
I can
capture
save
the chat.
it. I get it saved, and I will send you after this call. I'll send you the link. Let me just make sure I've got the right people that are on this call. Leah, Joan, Kane. I think I have everybody's email from when you registered.
Good.
So I will send an email with the chat on it, so you have the chat, and also the link to the recording if you want to hold on to that.
That'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you, Tony and Joan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. This was wonderful.
Yeah,
and
thank you all
thanks,
for
Dawn and the Taos Institute.
Stay connected. The Taos Institute, we have our big conference coming up in November, and everyone's invited to come and participate. It's our 25-year anniversary, so we're really excited about that. We're going to look at social construction practices through the last 25 years and begin thinking about the next 25 years. So we'd love your participation and input, and it's a great group of people that gather, and it's going to be a really exciting time. So visit our website or email me with more information.
And it's in Cancun.
And it's in
in
Cancun.
November.
Yeah, yeah, just before the
A
busy
year to live.
starts. Yeah, and if you have not read Joan and Tony's book, go ahead and order it on our website. It's still a 10% discount right now. Maybe I'll keep that discount up for a couple weeks just so people can continue buying it at the discount. And do get the book and read it, because they give you so many ideas for these conversations and the types of conversations that you can have. And I think that's what we need sometimes, is just ideas on how to get these started.
Yeah.
So it's a great resource. So thank you so much, and until next time.
Thank you.
Take care.